Chapter 3. Sam. Richard placed the embroidered silk cover on his bergonzi and closed the lid. "I am in control," he assured himself, while gripping the leather handle and taking in a deep breath. Normally, Richard Gaspar was in control, but when it came to Michelle, he became another person. A weaker man in some ways, yet much better in others. Richard could hear the crowd growing restless, so he quickly pushed his personal thoughts into the deepest recess of his mind, and by the time he sat down to sign autographs, he was ready. It took over an hour for the line to die down, because Richard wanted each eager fan to relish the exact moment their autograph book or program had been embellished with his precious signature. As soon as the last admirer walked away, an elderly gentleman approached the edge of the table with a warm, ancient smile. It immediately became apparent that Richard was pleasantly surprised. "Sam, it's good to see you. How are you?" "Ricky," was the old man's only reply, before coaxing Richard out of his chair and giving him a hug. Richard hadn't been called Ricky in many years. "What brings you here tonight, Sam? Not just my performance." "In a way, yes," Samuel replied. "Really?" The furrows in Samuel's weathered brow seemed to deepen, along with his voice. "I had everything on my calendar canceled this past month, so I could hear every one of your performances, Richard." In all the years they spent traveling together, Samuel had never called Richard by his given name. "I've seen you evolve into one of the best musicians alive, but I believe that you've gone as far as you can go." Samuel hesitated just long enough for Richard's eyes to open wide. "Without help." They were the exact same words that Samuel had used many years before, after Richard left home and was struggling to launch his solo career. Richard was 22 at the time and had successfully worked his way up to first chair in the local symphony, but was having no real success breaking into the world of a professional soloist. Samuel had appeared when Richard was having the most difficult time moving forward. Before Samuel had given Richard a chance to respond, he added, "Let me introduce myself. My name is Samuel Jackson, and I would like to be your sponsor." Richard's first impulse was to scoff and say, "And who are you? What do you mean, as far as I can go?" But then realized just how many doors had been closed to him for unknown reasons. Richard had decided to go against his knee-jerk reaction and responded, "Go on." Samuel then spent the next 5 years sponsoring Richard's career. He opened doors that Richard didn't even know existed and introduced him to the finest teachers, and he paid for everything. They traveled the world together, from competitions and performances to special invitations with royalty, taking each experience in stride and building upon every victory. "All I ask from you," Samuel had informed Richard, "is that someday, when I'm dead and gone, and my money and I are long forgotten, that when you stand on stage, after giving the greatest performance of your life, and you take that fifth and final bow, hesitate at the bottom and remember Sam." Samuel was waiting for Richard's response, just as he had been 12 years earlier. "What kind of help? Are you going to sponsor me all over again? Are you sure you're up to it, old man? I'm getting too set in my ways to start learning new tricks from an old dodger like you." Richard smiled and gave Samuel another hug. When Richard stepped back, Samuel's expression became solemn. "You need another violin," he proclaimed. Richard delicately placed his hand on top of his black leather case. This one has a lot of sentimental value to me, Sam. I don't get much of that anymore. I know. Keep it. You should never sell that violin. But you still need another one. Richard had always respected Samuel's opinion about violins, and he finally admitted, I was thinking the same thing right after the performance tonight. If I only had an instrument that could carry above everyone else to the back of the hall, then I could impress the critics who are still holding out. All that is true, confirmed Samuel. But the critics don't need another violin. You do. Richard purposely responded with the exact same words he had used 12 years earlier. Go on. I know that you've been visiting violin dealers, and I figure with the financial success of your tour and the wonderful selection of instruments available right now, you must be getting pretty close to making a decision. Richard nodded. He had put a serious amount of money aside, and also had made it a point to try out as many fine instruments as he could. Samuel continued with a deep sadness in his voice. I know that we had our differences in the past, Richard, but rest assured, I only want the best for you. As soon as Richard's expression began to soften, Samuel's voice instantly changed to a coarse, heavily accented whisper. Though I still hold you to our agreement, Ricky. Richard smiled while Samuel continued with his imitation of the pirate, Long John Silver. Samuel even closed his left eye and hunched over, just like he had when Richard was young. You haven't forgot our agreement, have you, Ricky? Richard shook his head. Arr, that's good, matey. Don't go backing out on a deal with old Sam, will ye? No, of course not, old man, was Richard's sincere reply, remembering Samuel's simple request in exchange for all that he had done. Good, then let's get on with it, Samuel continued lightheartedly. What do you think, Ricky? What have you found? Does anything out there interest you? Richard took a deep breath. I was considering the two Stradivarius in London, but each has its strong points as well as its drawbacks. The 1713 is in the best condition, an elegant instrument, well balanced, open and free. But it's just a little hollow on the D string. The 1721, on the other hand, has a richer, fuller sound. But I worry about all the repairs it's had. I wonder how stable it would be, traveling as much as I do. I'm even considering the Joseph Guarnerius in New York. It's the most powerful instrument, but it still lacks the sparkle on the E string that I've gotten so used to with my Bergonzi. Who knows? Maybe with a sound post adjustment, it would fit the bill. Richard shook his head. $4 million, though. Unless I could dig up Paganini as a duet partner, I'd be paying for it the rest of my life. I don't suppose you have an extra $2 million in your wallet. Samuel smiled and shook his head. Yet both of them knew that if that's what it would take, Samuel would have sold all that he still owned and bought it for Richard. Samuel waited until Richard's expression became a curious one, and he resolutely delivered the words. I know of a man who makes violins. A new violin? Richard's eyes flared. Are you joking, Sam? When Richard realized that Samuel was serious, he took a step back. I'm through trying new violins, Sam. You know what it's like. Richard felt he had to nip the subject in the bud, and he began ranting. I had makers hounding me before and after every concert, trying to get me to play their homemade violins, or at best, their copies of old instruments, and it drove me crazy. They almost beat me over the head with them, and if I hesitated, they would offer them to me for almost free. In fact, some of them were free if I would just give them an endorsement. I finally gave in and tried a few of the best ones because the makers assured me that they would get better with age and playing. Then, with time, they either became harsh or the sound completely died out, regardless of how they were readjusted. One violin developed so many cracks in it that it began looking more like the wood was holding the glue together. Samuel had prepared himself for Richard's reaction. Slowly and resolutely, he declared, "This man hounds no one. He makes no copies, and he does not give his violins away." "What's his name?" Richard was ready to pounce if it was one of the makers he had already dealt with. "Sean Diego." Richard's patience had run out. What kind of a name is Sean for a luthier? "What kind of a name is Richard for a virtuoso?" Samuel snapped back. Richard knew that he should have bit his tongue after remembering all of their conversations about changing his name for more audience appeal. Richard had refused to even consider it because he felt that it would dishonor his mother and father. In a calmer tone, Richard admitted, "I've heard the name before, and some interesting comments about his instruments, but I've never seen one. So, who is this Sean Diego? And if he makes the instruments you and others allude to, why haven't I met him? And why isn't he more famous?" Samuel smiled. "Time has always told who the true masters are, Richard. But the world usually never judges correctly until long after they are dead and gone." When Samuel relaxed against the table, his firmly pressed suit seemed to have more substance than the frail form supporting it inside. If you had wandered along a dusty road late at night in 1889 and discovered a poor, beggarly-looking man painting a picture of the night sky by candlelight, would you have even offered him $50 for it? Or would you have passed him by like all the others did, shaking your head? If you had walked past Stradivari's violin shop 2 blocks in 1743 and noticed a rundown house with a weather-beaten man looking 20 years older than he really was, dressed in loose, tattered clothing, would you have stopped and bought the heavy violin with the bulky scroll in the window? Or would you have wondered why he even bothered trying and pitied him while you went on your way? Richard knew that Samuel was referring to Starry Night, painted by Vincent van Gogh, and Niccolo Paganini's violin, the Canon, made by Joseph Guarneri. The painting was Van Gogh's greatest masterpiece, and the violin worth over $50 million. Easily the most valuable musical instrument in the world. Samuel continued, "I don't know much about Sean Diego, other than what I learned while visiting his shop and ordering instruments for 2 of my prodigies. But we are all much more than satisfied with the results." Richard was surprised at the inflection in Samuel's voice. Samuel was as harsh a critic as anyone when it came to fine violins. Samuel nodded. "He is different, though, and he lives in a different world than you and I. But rest assured, his instruments are real." Still doubtful, yet curious because of some intriguing comments he had heard, Richard decided to pursue the conversation a little further. "Can his instruments really compare with a Stradivarius or Guarnerius?" Samuel furrowed his eyebrows. "No living maker can compare with Stradivari or Guarneri, Ricky. You know that. It's like comparing yourself with Columbus and trying to cross the ocean again and discover America for the very first time." With Samuel's comment, Richard felt satisfied that the conversation had finally come to an end, and he smiled. Unlike most musicians, he could afford an old master instrument. He didn't have to compromise anything. Yet Samuel continued, "It's like trying to be Michelangelo, or comparing your new painting of The Last Supper with Da Vinci's old one, then expecting the curators to strip his off the wall and put yours on display instead. This violin maker is different, Richard. He makes true master instruments for living performers. Samuel put his hand on Richard's shoulder and admitted, his instruments can't compare with the old masters. Then, with a sly grin and a wink, he added, but you might also say that the old masters can't compare with him either. Richard was speechless. If you question their quality, the answer is yes. They are made at the highest level, with the finest ingredients, just like the masters over 250 years ago in Cremona, Italy. But more than that, Richard, Sean Diego will make the instrument you need. There was quick resentment in Richard's voice. Even if this luthier could make a better violin, what about my reputation, Sam? What about its effect on my career? What about the people who come to the concert hall expecting to hear a 300-year-old master instrument worth millions of dollars? Do you really think that I'm in a position to challenge all of the critics of the past 3 centuries? If you thought that I was up against a wall when you first met me, imagine the brick wall I would beat my head against if I were to start performing on a new violin. Samuel's resolve didn't waver with Richard's protest, and he patiently kept listening. To make matters worse, Richard fumed, you said that he won't make copies. Samuel nodded, and Richard continued with renewed vigor. At least the other violins I tried were beaten up and looked like a Stradivarius or Guarnerius. That way, most of the audience didn't even know the difference. Richard's jaw tightened. Did you hear those 2 critics tonight? He repeated Julia's words while almost spitting in Samuel's face. An air of virtuosity, yet lacking full expression. Could you imagine Julia's response if she caught me playing a shiny new violin? Samuel replied calmly. They were talking about you tonight, not your violin. Richard screamed, I don't care, Sam. I'm not taking that chance. I need the respect that only comes to those who play upon the old masters. You need to learn to respect the masters for what they are, Ricky, whether living or dead. Don't forget that you dreamed of becoming one someday. I just assumed that it was while you were still alive. Richard grabbed the handle of his violin case in frustration. I don't have time for this, Sam. I'm not the one to buck the system. I'm part of the system, and I like it. In 6 weeks, I have to play an entirely new program at Carnegie Hall, and I have a lot of work to do. Richard turned and walked away. Wait, Samuel called out. Samuel's feeble legs were unable to bring him up to Richard's side, and he desperately gasped out. I thought that you might feel this way, Richard. I know how much time you've wasted trying new instruments. Richard only stopped when Samuel stumbled and fell to the floor while grabbing at his arm. As Richard lifted Samuel back to his feet, he finally realized just how frail his old patron had become. Samuel was visibly hurt and still panting, yet he reached into his suit pocket and pulled out a small cluster of papers. Here, take this, he announced after prying open Richard's hand. Upon seeing a travel agent's itinerary, Richard shook his head in frustration. Yet he reluctantly swung the violin case over his shoulder and opened the bundle. What's this, Sam? It was an airline ticket to LaGuardia Airport, New York, with the words Carnegie Hall scrawled across the top. A second ticket's destination was to Las Vegas, Nevada. Beneath them, a check and a business card stapled together. The check read, Pay to the order of Sean Diego Luthier, $35,000. Written, $35,000 and no cents. For a violin, signed, Samuel J. Jackson. Samuel began smiling between his gasps of air. There are 2 of his instruments in the violin shop at Carnegie Hall right now. You remember how to get to Carnegie Hall, don't you? I thought that shop only dealt with old master instruments. Samuel's voice became melodramatic. They also carry his. Call Mr. Singer and specifically ask for them. In a lighter tone, he added, since you'll be performing there in 6 weeks anyway, fly out at my expense and try them on stage. Invite Mark and Circe and get their opinion. Richard still wasn't convinced, so Samuel literally began begging. Try them, Ricky. Compare them with the Guarnerius. Then do yourself a favor and use the other ticket. The change of atmosphere will do you good, and after 6 weeks, you just might have the violin you need. Richard was still reluctant. I don't like the idea of performing on a new violin, Sam. Don't think of it as a new violin, Richard. Think of it as an original work of art, made by a living master for a living master, and allow a foolish old man with no sense the opportunity of sponsoring you this one last time. Samuel grabbed Richard's hand, firmly crumpling the check and tickets between their palms. Without a goodbye, other than the mist in his ancient eyes, Samuel walked away and left Richard standing in the hallway alone.